Hello, everybody. Welcome to our respective living rooms, our respective kitchens, closets, home offices. I'm actually technically back at my office now, but welcome everybody to Communicating Bad News presented by Groupe.io. We have an awesome action-packed webinar for you guys today that I'm really excited to help moderate, as well as in a moment introduce our esteemed panelists. Let me just pull up the screen share here as we go through the technical side of hosting a webinar. And I believe we all have these slides in front of us. Yes, perfect. So this is Communicating Bad News presented by Groupe.io. I'm excited to be here with you all today. And thank you all for showing up if you're live with us. If you are watching this not live, but on the recording, hello from the past, and I hope the future is good. If you want to talk about today's webinar online, please use hashtag internal comms. A couple housekeeping items. This is going to be an action-packed hour of conversation with our panelists, who I'll introduce in a moment. Definitely throughout this, we want you to ask questions. There is a question feature within GoToWebinar. You can use that directly. There's also a chat feature as well. So ask questions throughout. We will reserve time at the end for questions, but we'll also, if we've got interesting questions during the conversation, we'll be sure to pull them up and toss in the things that you want to know about. Anything not answered during the webinar, we will cover off at the end. And as you know, this webinar is being recorded, and you'll get the recording sent to you afterwards for the low price of free, actually. And it wouldn't be a webinar without some goodies at the end, right? So stick around until the end, because our panelists have some really cool resources that they are sharing with you. Make sure you don't miss out on that. Let's do some introductions, shall we? My name is Rajiv Nathan, aka Raj Nation. I am Groupe.io's hype man, and I run a company called Startup Hype Man, where I essentially hype up businesses, helping them get their story right, acting as their spokesperson, and really helping them stand out and stand apart from the crowd. A lot of my stuff is external facing communications. But you're not here to see me today. You're actually here to learn from two people who are also in this virtual room right now, so to speak. And I'll start with esteemed person number one. And I'm going to give him the introduction that he deserves. So, ladies and gentlemen, in the left corner of your screen, or at least the left corner of my screen, hailing from the greater Chicagoland area, he is the president of Inside Comms. Please welcome Gary Ross.
Wow, that's fantastic. Thanks, Rajiv.
Gary,
that's great. It's great to be here with everybody.
This man, it's great to have you here. And just so everyone's aware, this man is the president of Inside Comms, which means a lot of things, including he has the domain insidecomms.com, if you can believe that. But Inside Comms is a training, coaching, and consulting firm focused on, you guessed it, internal communication. Over his 30+ year career, he has worked as a consultant, a corporate executive, Emmy-nominated broadcast journalist as well. He is now in production of a suite of online internal communication training, and his current work includes coaching and consulting CEOs, C-level execs, and internal comm teams on corporate transformation, M&A, change, things of that nature. He has led comms departments at places like Hyatt, CDW, and Fortune. He's also been a guest speaker on communications and change for places like the Healthcare Business Women's Association, PR Week, Northwestern University, University of Georgia, DePaul University, my alma mater, and the Great Place to Work Institute, among others. Gary, we're so excited to have you here today. Thank you for joining our panel discussion.
Hey, it's great to be here, Rajiv. Thanks a lot, and thanks for the terrific introduction as well. You know, this topic is so important, and we're looking forward to diving into this with everybody today.
Definitely. But he's not the only person here, are you, Gary?
I
am
have not.
Another panelist.
We do.
And now, in the right corner of your screen, or at least the right corner of my screen, also residing in the greater Chicago area. Please welcome James Warda.
How you doing? It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited to have you. I should have called you James the Funk Master Warda, and we'll get to that in a second. But James is a keynote speaker, keynote speaker, conference presenter, and author of Where Are We Going So Fast? He blogs for the Chicago Tribune Media Group. He's written for the Tribune itself, Pioneer Press, Chicken Soup for the Soul. In addition, he's an adjunct professor for the School of Communications at Loyola University in Chicago. Hey, so am I, but just a different college than Loyola. We have so much in common, all of us. Where he's also a member of the Loyola Communications Advisory Board. James brings over 15 years of experience in leadership and strategic communications at Fortune 100 brands like Allstate, Baxter, Boeing, McDonald's, Walgreens, and many, many more. Currently, he's leading communications and marketing at a national healthcare nonprofit, the Home Centered Care Institute. And this is why I said I should have introduced him as the Funk Master, because he is also the lead singer and rhythm guitarist for The Groove, a funk rock blues band based in the Chicago and Milwaukee area. James, can you give us a tune on this webinar?
Yeah, I call it the communication blues, and so we'll be talking about that today. And then Gary and I have an interpretive dance that we'll be doing later on too, so that'll be really cool.
Yeah, that's right before the grand finale. So be sure to stay tuned for that, and we'll have DVDs available of that at the end too.
Perfect. Yeah, and that one they don't get for free though. They have to actually pay the premium.
That's $15.99. Yes.
Well, we're going to dive into our conversation in a second, but first, I just want to let everyone know today's webinar, Communicating Bad News, is presented by Groupe.io. If you're not familiar with Group, maybe this situation sounds a little familiar to you. As a comms leader, maybe you find your team is all over the place. You're communicating in one app, assigning tasks in another, jotting approvals on paper and pen, and I mean, how come it feels like you've reviewed invoices the same way 800 times and there still isn't a process for that? It's impossible to stay on top of everything and make sure everyone else does their part with 7 different apps, each having their own nuances. Working with the same people every day really shouldn't feel like such a mess. And that's where Groupe.io comes in. Groupe.io creates structure for literally anything that involves people. So you can message team members, digitize forums, build workflows on the fly, share documents, checklists, and collaborate with each other, all inside of a single platform that looks and feels like your favorite social media app. Basically, what I'm saying is communicate with anyone and do all the things that all those 1,800 other apps do, but better and in one single place. You can check it out at Groupe.io and download the Group app in the App Store today. All right, let's get down to the nitty gritty. Today, we are talking about communicating bad news. Now, I guess the best way to kick this off really is just that, like, I think we could label 2020. If we had to like pick a title for 2020, it would be bad news. So with that in mind, and we know what's happened this year, right? From I would, in my opinion, I'd say it started with Kobe, and then with coronavirus to civil rights movement, and I think everything in between along the way. How would each of you, Gary, we'll start with you. How would you define bad news?
Well, it's one of those things. In some ways, we kind of know it when we see it. So if something comes out and affects us in a way that we don't react positively to it, that kind of puts us into a bad news category. But also I think if you're part of an organization, part of a business, if news comes out that has potential risks to an organization, has a potential to, and those risks can be anything like slowing down productivity. It could be a financial risk. It could be actually a safety risk, a physical safety risk, depending on what the news might be. If it's some sort of emergency, anything that could have a potential negative impact on the organization, we could classify as bad news and look at a way to go ahead and address that.
James, how are you defining bad news?
For me, bad news is anything that makes you feel churn in the pit of your stomach. You know, there's an emotional component to it that, you know, and I think Gary and I have talked about it, but that, you know, bad news for one person could be good news for the other. So you can never just assume what the bad news is, you know, and if you're talking to 10 people, one of them might have a, you know, be churning inside. So it's a key piece of it.
With that in mind, so actually I really like that description of it's the churn or the pit you start to feel in your stomach. And knowing that, hey, bad news might be good for some. I'm actually curious to follow up on that. Like, how do you kind of like hedge your bets then, knowing that what you say may be bad for some but good for others?
Well, so I'll just jump in since I brought that up. For me, as you're planning your communications, you want to address that it could be, you know, that other piece, that it could be a possibility. For example, right? If a company, I'll use an example. If a company is going to move its headquarters, right? That moving their headquarters, say from the suburbs to downtown, that could be good news for some. That, you know, maybe they're younger people who want to be in the city, they already live in the city, they're excited about it, etc. Whereas some people might not want to make that commute, etc. So as you're doing your communications, you make sure you've got some key message in there and Q&A around, you know, addressing that this could be an issue for some and what the company is doing to address some of those issues.
Yeah, and I would also say that really emphasizes the point on how important it is to know your audience. So is understanding who in different segments or different people in your audience, who this is bad news for, who it is good news for, because if it's something that you need to orchestrate like an office move and make sure it goes well, or even something else, you know, unfortunately work reductions or job reductions, something that needs to be orchestrated properly, really digging down and knowing and understanding your audience, what motivates them, what you want them to think about a situation and feel, so they ultimately do, and what you need them to do to carry forth the particular, whether it's change or an event that's happening. Understanding what motivates and drives each part of your audience is so critical in this case, because of, you know, the point that James brought up, that bad news for somebody else could be good news for someone else as well.
Building off of that, then, what would you say, Gary, are some of the key risks facing an internal comms team when they do have to share bad news?
Screwing it up. And sorry to be blunt, but in a lot of these situations, we've got one chance to get this right, and so it's best to be able to take a step back, and this is why strategic communications is so important. When we can get connected with some of the decision makers or executives who are working on a particular initiative, particular project ahead of time, we can begin to strategize on our communications to see that, to look for communication implications in certain things, because when we're then when we're ready to go out and roll out this news, announce this rules, announce the change, that that we're as prepared and as well researched as possible. So when we go out there for that first time, we get the message that we need to get out there in front of folks. We're controlling that message. We're setting the tone that we want to set. And getting out there as soon as we can, and getting all our ducks in a row beforehand so we can communicate right the first time.
James, so Gary led off there with screwing it up. Do you have something as blunt as that, or maybe not, but what do you see as key risks?
And just so you know, that is a very technical term.
Yeah,
it's
sorry for all the industry jargon.
Doth not screweth it up. Yeah, and I think kind of piggybacking on that is that, again, if you go back to the emotional churn, right? So you're about to share bad news, right? So you're about to share bad news. People aren't going to want to hear the news typically. They've probably heard rumors about the news. So I think the key is credibility. So when you go out and you're about to communicate, they're looking to you or leadership really, but the communications group behind that as a source of credibility. Because when things are going bad, you want to know someone's in charge. You want clear, direct communication. You want answers to your top of mind questions. So it's very important that you've built up that bank of credibility, so they know there's a source of information they can trust. And I think one of the things Gary and I have talked about is how important it is that as a communications group, you know what's happening and you know what is going to happen as much as possible. Because what you don't want to do when you announce it is say, oh, there are no planned layoffs as part of this announcement. And then a month later, you're in a leadership meeting and one of the leaders mentions the layoffs that are coming. Well, you do that, you've just impacted the credibility of your leadership. You've impacted your credibility as a communications group. And the next time they're not going to be as, ready to believe you. So I think that's another key piece.
And speaking about being blunt, you've got to do that in these conversations, and those conversations that James was just referring to, that I was talking about just a moment ago about being strategic. I've said to executives, CEOs, executives, HR people many times, you got to be careful. Whatever we're saying now, we have to be able to look back to 3, 6, 9, 12 months down the road and be comfortable that we said it. So think now. If we're ready to roll out what we're going to say, think now, because we're going to need to live with this later on, and that can affect our messaging. And to James's point, the credibility could be shot if we come out and say something that all of a sudden looks totally different 3 months from now.
And
if you don't mind, Gary,
Rajiv,
I want to follow up on that point. Yeah, go ahead, James.
I'm sorry. So people have long memories too. That's the thing. You have to treat your people like they're adults, and you have to treat them that they remember stuff. Leaders might go, well, we said that 2 months ago. People remember, and they will call you on it. And it might not show up right away, but down the road it starts showing up in people leaving the company, engagement report, survey reports going down. So people are smart.
So let's build off that a little bit more, because obviously 2020 being the year of bad news, more or less, there's been a lot of instances where this has been able to come up. I would say the most recent one has been the next wave of a civil rights movement, if we want to call it that, or the next iteration of it. And it's involved a lot of internal communications, as not just the external, like what are you posting on Instagram, but the internal as well. And I have been privy to some organizations doing this really well. Other organizations choosing to just say nothing because they're like, oh, it'll blow over. Other organizations saying something, but it just really backfiring on them. So how do we, and Gary, I'll start with you on this. How do you balance something like that? Like knowing that it's in your best interest to say something to your team in the heat of the moment, but that also, like you mentioned, you have to understand, and you want to be human about it, right? You want to like have that human emotion to it. Also understanding that you may not have the answers today, and that, like you said, 6 months from now, a year from now, people, and as James echoed, people aren't going to forget that this is what's said. So how do you balance that short term with the long term?
It's incredibly difficult, and it requires thoughtful, frank conversations internally with senior leaders, with your communications team, HR, informal influencers, I like to call them in an organization, people not necessarily with a big title, but every group has those folks that everyone listens to and has their ear to the ground, seeking out what they think about sort of what the pulse of the organization is. I think it's important to resist what may feel like an urge to weigh in on everything. By the same token, the need to say something about something so big as these social society conversations, civil rights, however we want to label it, these conversations, when something is so big, we may feel the need that, yes, we have to say something. So if we decide to say something, we have to think about what the objective of that communication is. What are we trying to do with this communication? How will it, and it's not crass to think this way, it's important to, but how will this benefit our people, our organization? What are we trying to do by saying something? Because just saying something just to say something, we've seen how those things fall flat. You see it on LinkedIn, you see it on the news. Saying something just to say something is kind of a recipe for failure. So thinking about what is our objective, going back to what we should be thinking for all communications, really, what is our objective for what we want to say? Is it to show our people that we're going to double down on our inclusion efforts? Is it to show various external stakeholders that we're going to look to do the same? What is the objective? And then craft something around that objective. And getting people, by the way, to align on that objective will also help with the review process and so forth. And then float, before you send something out, float a couple of trial balloons, especially with those informal influencers, other folks in the organization who you trust, and say, hey, if we say something like this, how do you think it'll go over? And I would guess after you've been that thoughtful, you probably about 80-85% in the ballpark there, but they might have some good points to offer you to kind of really make it the best sort of piece of communication that it could possibly be.
James, I'll ask you, I guess, a different version of that question, and whether it is civil rights, Black Lives Matter, or whether it's like, even a month before this, furloughs, layoffs, right? Taking into account everything Gary just said, how do you ensure that the message you deliver internally still comes across as like authentic and not contrived?
Yeah, well, few things. So Rajiv, you mentioned be human, right? And that's pretty much, if I had to put my approach to communications in 2 words, it would be that: be human. You got to be transparent, and you have to be sincere. Again, people know sincerity. They can smell it, they can see it, they know it right away. So whatever you're going to do, like Gary said, it can't be check the box. If you do it as a check the box, let's quickly put out a message about how we're committed to diversity and inclusion, but then let's not mention it again and for a few months, right? Then don't do it. Don't, because you're going to hurt yourself more than you're going to help yourself, and you're going to hurt the people who really need to hear the message. So the first thing is be sincere. And how that shows up when you're working with leadership, when you're doing messaging, is again, talk to the leaders, and you need to get an understanding of, do they really believe it, right? Because if they're in there and they don't really believe their message, but they want you to come up with something that, yeah, you're going to probably have to do it, but you already see the problem, right? So the other thing is, sincerity really comes across nicely with face-to-face, better than in just sending out an email or doing a LinkedIn post. So get them up in front of people, either at a town hall or even in a video or something. You have to see somebody's eyes to see some sincerity. And then I think to Gary's other point is, what happens tomorrow, right? So right now, everybody's doing communications about diversity and inclusion, and it's critical. But do they really mean it? Is there really going to be action? And 6 months from now, is it still going to be something that's woven into their messaging and their business, right? So to me, that's how you set yourself apart. But the key word is sincerity. be sincere, because
And
I'm telling you, you know it yourself. You know when you're with somebody, in your gut, you can tell, do they mean it or do they not? And if they don't, you stop listening.
yeah, and to build on that, to be sincere, I think requires you and or us as communicators to help our organization take a good hard look at itself. And I know it's easy for us here in webinar land to be talking about this. This is hard, and we've been in this situation, and you stand there at your desk and you take a deep breath and you say, all right, I'm really going to go talk to the CEO or the EVP about this. And yeah, because that's your job. But if you're going to come out and kind of build on James's point, if you're going to come out with a statement that's going to be sincere about diversity and inclusion, it needs to be something that your organization has at least some credibility to talk about, and as James said, to live up to in the future. And we need to look as communicators, help our organizations look inward to say, is this something we really should be talking about, or is this something we really should be saying? And those are hard questions to ask. There's no doubt about it. But we've been in these situations, and you kind of take a deep breath and you go ahead and do it. But I'll give you an example of companies that have fallen on this, and I've seen this on LinkedIn and on Twitter just in the last several weeks, when a company will come out and talk about a commitment to diversity and inclusion, and somebody instantly replies and talks about the photo of their board of directors on their website, which has zero diversity in it. And boom, they just fell flat. And there's no sincerity, as that James was saying is so essential. So to be sincere, we've got to look inward and say, do we have the credibility to come out and say some of these things that we're gonna say? And again, it's hard, but it's important in this case.
Hey, Rajiv, just one thing to add on that too, that just came up when Gary mentioned that. It's really important to plan ahead, right? So you need to have a crisis communication strategy and plan, because, for example, when I was with a former company, a large pharmaceutical company that rhymes with Schmalgreens. No, I was with Walgreens Boots Alliance, and I'm not going to give away anything because everybody faces this. One of the keys, like Gary and you were both mentioning, is what do you talk about and what do you not comment on, right? So for us, it was, is it about our team members? Is it about one of our stores? Is it about, but what about when it's a shooting, right, in the country that doesn't necessarily affect your stores or your customers or your people, but is still a very critical issue and in the consciousness, right? Sure. So you need to think about those things ahead of time and have some criteria. Otherwise, Gary, I'm sure you can attest, you're going to be in that, it'll happen, and you'll be in a room with the leadership and they'll look to you and go, do we talk about it or do we not? You don't want to be making up your plan and criteria right then. So as much planning as you can do, better.
Yeah,
one of the things,
that's where we as communicators add value to our organization. And even these are hard questions to have and opinions to offer up. The right leaders in the right organizations will appreciate that, and they will come back to you again in tough situations to continue to weigh in. It's a unique way we as communicators can make a difference to our organizations in our roles, where it's like I keep saying, it's hard, but we're fortunate to be in that position where we can make such an impact.
I want to remind our viewers who are watching this live, you can submit questions through the questions or chat window within the GoToWebinar control panel on your screen. One of the things that was mentioned in our conversation thus far was the importance of taking accountability to what you are going to say. And I think that's part of the sincerity, right? If you're not going to hold yourself accountable to what you say, how can you possibly be sincere? I'll give you an anecdotal story here of an organization I know that came out with their message on diversity, and it was the external facing message. It was external communication, posted on social media, immediately, kind of like Gary, what you said, got slammed by ex-employees saying how they don't represent any of those things that they say they represent. And then 2 days later, they had a follow-up post. Oh, and it was the criticism was they don't represent these things they say they want to represent. And then on top of that, the message that they delivered sounded insincere, or which is exactly what the opposite of what we just said. And then 2 days later, they actually posted a follow-up to say, like, we're listening, we're learning, but just so you know, that message that you said was insincere was actually created by our Black employees, which is like the exact like refuting of taking accountability. And if that's how they are in an external setting, I mean, I don't know what it's like internally, but it's clearly a reflection in some capacity. So I think it's obvious to hear, yeah, you got to be accountable to what you say, and to understand that conceptually. But how do we take it from the conceptual understanding to the actual, like what do comms leaders need to do to hold themselves accountable to whatever message they are going to deliver to their team?
Well, I think we're talking about the events of the day too, which quote unquote isn't necessarily bad news. It's certainly sensitive issues, but I think we can broaden it into it being a sensitive issue. But when we do have bad news to communicate in an organization, say it's a round of job reductions, there are certain steps that we can take to ensure that we're being sincere, we're communicating with credibility. And I'll throw out a couple, and James can chime in as well. But being strategic, as I said before, getting in those conversations with people leading that particular initiative, so you can bring up any communication implications that perhaps they may not be thinking about. It gives you time to craft that messaging and even test it out with some of those informal influencers that we talked about earlier. But then also you can roll out, as you're rolling out some of this bad news, do a limited rollout initially. So take a small group perhaps of senior leaders, and or maybe the level below that, and do the initial round of communication to them and see what their questions are and see what their concerns are and see how they think it's going to play with maybe the next level in the organization. And from there, you can iterate your communication plan really live. You can make some changes. You can get a sense check in real time that the things that you were thinking of, the assumptions that you were making are correct, or they need to be adjusted. So that's one way to sort of fine tune things to a bit of a broader audience. And also what that does is it gives them, this next level group of leaders, a sense of what it is you want to be going out and saying, and also how you're going to be doing it too. Are you announcing it at in-person meetings? Is it an email, a voicemail, what have you? So they can then be in the best possible position to answer questions from their people when they hear the news. So as we all know, people like hearing things directly from their immediate managers. So even if there needs to be a big sweeping message from on high, if those managers are equipped to be able to answer questions from people, that helps the news be a lot more authentic and sincere as well. So those are just a few steps you can take to have the news, to communicate that news in an authentic way where the communication is two-way and we're truly helping people understand and process some information that might be tough.
Mm-hmm. James, how do we hold ourselves accountable to the message we're delivering?
Well, I'll use that example you just shared, right? I think I heard three kind of lessons in that example. The number one first thing is there's a lot of knee-jerk reaction going on. Something like this happens, everybody feels like they have to say something quickly. It's like, well, oh my gosh, we got to do something. We got to put out a press release. We got to, yes, you need to be timely, but you don't want to go out and as Professor Ross has said, screw it up. yeah, all of your competitors might be out there with messages, but is it going to hurt you if you take one extra day to make sure you've got it right, that you've checked internally to make sure that you're not going to put your foot in your mouth? So the first thing is don't knee jerk. The second thing that goes along with that is kind of the prime principle that we've always gone by is you don't communicate externally before you communicate internally. Now there are some instances where you absolutely have to do that, where there's like insider trading, whatever. But even in those cases, you better communicate internally 2 minutes after you've done it externally. But in this case, why are you going out with an external message before you've talked to your own people? Now, they might have, but before I would ever do an external LinkedIn post or anything from a company, I'd have a CEO in a sincere way send a message or something, a video internally, and get that out to as many people as possible. Maybe call a quick town hall, whatever, and share these messages internally. And also, and then the final piece is, I don't know if you follow Brene Brown about vulnerability, right? But you can be vulnerable in these situations. It's okay to say, hey, we don't have the answers. Hey, if you look at our board of directors, obviously we've got a lot to do. And I'm hearing a lot of that now. People are, in positions of authority, are coming out now. Is it credible or not? Is it sincere? Well, we'll see. Time will tell. But they're saying we've got to do this better, right? So if you have a choice between following a leader who says, who makes a mistake and doesn't acknowledge it, and a leader who makes a mistake and says, I did some things that, we did some things that we shouldn't have done this way, and we want to do them better. People are going to want to follow that second person. So those are key pieces.
Yeah,
I really
or
like
we
that.
wish we would have done
Gary.
something, and now we know that that we want to. Another thing that James and I talk about a lot is the notion that everything communicates, and it's not just what you say, but it's what you do, and then a lot of times it's what you don't do that communicates, especially in a sensitive situation where there's bad news or it's just a sensitive situation in general. It's human nature. Our minds are on alert. We're wondering, when's the next shoe going to drop? Is something bad going to happen? And I'll give you an example. Even the most well-intentioned things can create an issue. So recently, I was aware of a situation where a company was announcing it was a pretty big organizational shift. And they decided to do, at the last minute, they decided to do a virtual town hall, which is basically, a kind of a webinar like this. And the channel that they used, or the tool that they used, could only accommodate 1,000 people on the tool. And but there's thousands more in the organization. So they kind of looked through the list and they said, okay, well, we'll invite this first 1,000 people to this town hall. We're going to get our news out there. We're going to make sure these people understand everything that we're talking about. Like I said, this is kind of a big reorganization, and how those things go sometimes. People wonder, the rumors get started. Well, so these people were on this town hall, and the 1,000 that were on the town hall thought the explanation was terrific. And they really understood where things were, and they appreciated everybody's time. Word about that town hall, though, got to all these other people who were not on it. They didn't know why they weren't invited to the town hall, and they thought they were about to get laid off. And rumors started spreading that whoever wasn't on that town hall, their job was going to be eliminated. And nothing could be farther from the truth. The only reason those people weren't on the town hall was because the tool they were using couldn't fit more than 1,000 people. It was a pure logistic issue. But people read into that and saw what they thought was a sign that they were gonna lose their jobs. So everything, and people felt terrible about this, and they had to run and communicate as fast as they could. No, 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 it doesn't mean anything. Don't worry about it. And we're going to do other town halls for other people. And they kind of had to play catch up. But there was no ill intent. It was a pure logistical issue. So reminding yourself that everything communicates, even things that you might overlook or may only consider for logistic reasons, can have these effects that you don't necessarily anticipate.
Gary, this is really interesting you brought that up, because one of the questions we had in the chat probably 3 minutes before you mentioned that story, I don't know if it was the same story or just very similar, but I'll say the situation they wrote and then the question they had. They said, recently there was a large multinational employer who performed a mass layoff of over 3,500 employees via video conferencing. I don't know if it sounds like, I don't think it's the same story as what you were giving here, but
No.
Employees reacted negatively to the approach, some recording the video and then sending it out to the media. What alternative ways do you feel that message could have been delivered?
Well, I'm not aware of I think I remember the story. I need to know, a few more details on that, but to really get to it. But perhaps, we're in a virtual world right now, so things are not ideal. So there needs to be a little bit of a give and take and understanding for that. But instead of, I think I might be remembering which one this is now. I think was the number 9,000 involved somewhere.
I don't know. They didn't get into that detail in this, but
yeah, well,
I don't know the example
okay.
it's referencing.
But maybe a way to do this was to at least have smaller groups where there was a more familiar face on that webinar, where you could, instead of this big mass broadcast, you could have a little bit more give and take, answer questions, hear some concerns, find a more compassionate way to do that. The tone of warmth, empathy is so important in these situations, and it's part of those conversations we should have with ourselves and say, okay, is a mass broadcast to thousands of people the best way to do this, or can we, enlist folks who can do smaller groups of webinars, and maybe they're simultaneous, maybe they're not, but where we could have more of an interactive, more personalized message to hear people's thoughts and let people express themselves. So I think that's one way in that particular case you can accommodate that. But yeah, I mean, we're in a virtual situation. It's you got to make some accommodation for that, I think.
I want to make sure we get into some other questions that were kind of on our docket for today. So I'll direct the next question at you, James, and I'm gonna advance the conversation a little bit. Oftentimes, maybe not oftentimes, but there are cases where there is a personal internal dilemma at play in the process of delivering bad news internally. And that is when you, the leader, do not actually agree with the decision yourself, but you are still tasked with delivering that news to your team. What kind of advice do you have when someone's in that situation?
That's a really good question, and it's one that every communicator is going to face at some point, and in your career you'll face it. You'll face it multiple times. I think the first thing is, allowing yourself to feel it. We go back to that, communication continuum. Are people aware of it? Do they accept it? Do they understand it? And Gary talks a lot about the change curve, first you just have to allow yourself to process the fact that the emotion of what you're hearing and that you don't agree with it, and talk about that with your team, and because you're people too, you're getting the message too, just before everyone else. So you kind of work through that a little bit, and you might not have a lot of time. Maybe you take 10 minutes and process the emotions. I don't know. The next thing is, as communicators, we need to then go find out, okay, what is the real deal here? Why is this being done? What's the business case? And ask the tough questions that are the top of mind. I call them the top of mind, tip of tongue questions that employees are going to have about this. You're basically you're their representative in that meeting with the leaders. And what you want to do is, you want to answer those questions for employees before they have to ask them. So hopefully in talking with leaders, you will begin to see why this is being done, right? And it's typically being done for the business, which makes sense. There's a business strategy behind it. But as you're asking those questions, you have to ask questions that might make their eyes roll. You have to speak truth to power. We teach, if you teach at Loyola, one of the school communications main phrases is speaking truth to power. And you also have to make them aware of implications of the different things they're about to do. So, you will find it. You will, and it's like a high wire act. You're there to represent the company, and you're there to represent the employee. So,
Gary, can you add a little bit more to that from your perspective?
Yeah, again, this is tough, but understanding that there's, I'll call it a professional you and a personal you in this situation, and it's okay to have that. There's the professional you that the leadership of the company is looking toward to help manage this and communicate this piece of bad news. It's a high visibility situation. You want to do well and prove yourself, but by the same token, let's again use the example of job reductions. You're sad that this is happening to your company, that there may be people that you like that are no longer going to have a job. You may even be thinking that you might get laid off at the end of this. And actually, I was in a situation like this earlier in my career where I was brought in to communicate a round of layoffs, and they might have been sensing this because at some point during our planning, they said to me, Gary, don't worry about it. You're not part of this. So at least they acknowledged at that point that, there's this personal side and this professional side. That's okay. Don't conflate, your sense of self with the job that you have to do. People are obviously going to be upset and not like this job reduction news, but it's not your fault. It is not something that you need to feel guilt for or let people put any guilt on you about that. In fact, your role as a communicator is to make that reality of the business, and it's a reality of the business. The business has decided this is going to happen, so it's going to happen. So the way I look at it sometimes is I'm going to make this lousy situation as least lousy as I can make it for the company, for the people involved, and for myself, so I can help not only the organization through this and make this business move that they've decided they need to make, but also help people individually through it as well and make it as a bad situation as best as it can possibly be. So I kind of flip it and look at it in that way. So that's helped me get through situations like that.
hey,
Let's see
Rajiv.
if we can bang through one or two more questions here before we wrap. Do you have something quick to add on that, James?
Just real quick, I have seen it happen too when you ask a question of a leader or you bring up implications, where they will actually change some of their strategy because of something you've brought up. They may not do some of the things that they were going to do because you're making them aware of implications and consequences. So we have a very critical role, a strategic role.
Yeah, an example of that, it was a post-merger situation, and there's job reductions as there are normally in those situations. And just nonchalantly, this was right around the holiday time, people are going through a list of dates of job reductions, and one of them was like December 19th, the week before the holidays. And I raised my hand and I'm like, you guys can't do that. Not only is it not compassionate for those people, but what kind of message are you going to leave for the people who are staying? And they hadn't really considered that, and they wound up moving the dates. And so that's part of our job, as James said, is to raise those implications that people otherwise might not be seeing, because in our role we're uniquely looking through that lens.
Let's see if we can get through one or two quick questions before we head to our final wrap up. James, I think it was you last week when we were in a huddle talking about this webinar today, who talked about a story that you personally had where you had walked into a meeting with your boss and your boss's boss, both in the room. So can you share that story and overall speak to the importance of the optics of a situation when delivering bad news?
Yeah. Unfortunately, I have firsthand knowledge of this, and it was at a previous employer. And as it happens, there was reorganization going around, and you see a lot of doors shut, and people are running to the printer, and people, that's those unintentional messages right up front. You're going, whoa, something's going on. Mm-hmm. And then my leader was no longer with the company. So, and then that next week, I got an email that asked me to attend a meeting in an unfamiliar conference room at the end of the day. And nobody wants to attend a meeting in an unfamiliar conference room at the end of the day. So, yeah, I pretty much knew what was coming. And a lot of people have gone through this, but it doesn't make it any easier. And I remember walking into that unfamiliar conference room, seeing another leader and seeing someone from HR. And I love HR, but when you see HR in there, you know it's coming. And so I was told about my position, being eliminated. And for an hour, they talked to me about, well, here's what's going to happen. Here's all the paperwork, and you sign this, give me this. For that hour, I did things robotically, but it was like a Charlie Brown cartoon. If anyone remembers those, I might be too old. I don't know. Where the adults go,
saying, wah, wah, wah.
Wah, wah. So when you're trying to communicate to somebody who's in emotional churn, you're going to have to do it over and over and over again. But here's the thing. I remember standing outside in the parking lot and looking back up at the building going, wow, what just happened, right? Mm-hmm. You got to take care of people, so it's not just what you communicate, it's what you do the next day and how you take, because everybody, and look at what's going on right now. How many people are going through that kind of situation? So we just got to take care of each other.
Let's begin our wrap up now and just head to some final audience Q&A here. One of the questions was around bad news leaking. And there's kind of two ways to take this. One is, how do you handle it when bad news leaks out before you're ready to deliver it? And I think the other way to answer this is it ever appropriate to let bad news leak, like intentionally leak, before you deliver it internally? Gary, we'll start with you.
Well, intentionally leaking is a dangerous game, and in general, I would suggest not doing that. You're kind of playing games at that point, at least it seems like to me. So if you're confident in your story and your rationale in the way you're going to communicate the news, there's really no reason to kind of play games with those kind of leaks. If something does inadvertently leak beforehand, you've got some choices to make. Sometimes you can accelerate your announcement and just go with it. Sometimes there may be things that are happening that mean that you're not ready to make that announcement. And you might have to come up with an interim statement that must be truthful, but also doesn't necessarily confirm or deny what those rumors are or what that leak is. And it depends also what the leak is also. I mean, if the leak is of a nature where it's obvious that it's true, was there a memo with somebody's signature left on a printer by mistake, and it says this is going to happen, and the news is obviously that's actually the story, then that's probably one of those cases where you'd need to accelerate an announcement. But if there's a way, if you need to still hold it off, you just got to be very careful about what it is that you're going to say.
James, can you add a maybe 30-second lightning response to that
Yeah,
question?
yeah. First thing is, no matter what comms plan you have to have a plan B for a leak. You know, if something leaks, you've got to have a plan B. That's the first thing. The second thing is, it goes back to that main principle, sincerity, right? So how would I have felt if somebody had leaked to me about my position, right? You're talking about human beings. So be sincere. I was at a company where we were communicating benefits changes. Somebody attended one of our webinars, screenshot one of our webinars, sent it to a reporter. Literally the next day, Wall Street Journal, the letter we had written from our executive was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. So there's a saying, you have to basically do everything you do with the thought that it might be on the cover of the Wall Street Journal the next day. That happened to me. So leaks aren't a good thing. I would never intentionally do it.
Whether faucets or words, I think I agree with you. Their leaks are not a good
Exactly.
Let's wrap up here. And before our viewers depart, I want you to have a chance to share some awesome free goodies with them. So let me just pull up the slide again. We'll start with 48 lessons learned in the job search. James, if you want to let our viewers know what that is all about.
Yeah, well, as I just talked about, going through a job search, and I had gone through it twice, but 11 years apart. I learned a lot about it. I talked to a lot of other people going through it, and again, applied some of my own principles to, I was asked after I went back to work to write 1 page of lessons learned, and because I'm who I am and a writer, and I couldn't help myself. So there's about 25 pages in this thing. So I offer it up, and hopefully it's helpful to people. And you can always feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. And if I can help you in a job search, especially in communications, I will.
Yeah, and those of you watching, if you are, a manager, an HR leader of some kind, this couldn't be a great tool if you have to go through layoffs or furloughs to help your employees transition out of the company and find work. Because I know when it comes to these COVID-induced layoffs, no company is sitting here happily letting go of their staff and wants them to, end up at great companies. And just so everyone's aware, that's a PDF that's actually in the handout section of your GoToWebinar on your control panel. It's actually already been dropped there by our meeting organizer. It'll also be included in the follow-up email. Gary, can you let everyone know about the Inside Comms job board?
Yeah, so on our insidecomms.com website, we have a section called the job board. We update that weekly. It's exclusively for internal communications jobs. So the idea is that a lot of places it's hard to find jobs that are specifically for internal communications. It seems like we're left sometimes to filter through all the PR jobs and other things. This is a place to go exclusively for internal communications jobs. We update it weekly. We make sure that the links are working when we update it. So we urge you to check it out. We've been updating it on Wednesdays. So please take a look, and hopefully you can find it helpful. We've gotten some good feedback so far on LinkedIn who have found the resource helpful. So hope it is to you too as well. It's insidecomms.com/job-board.
Thank you, Gary. And again, whether it's the 48 lessons learned PDF or the Inside Comms job board, telling someone that their job has been eliminated is bad news. And one of the ways you can help deliver that bad news is to say, hey, but we're looking out for you. Here's a resource for you. Here's something that can help. Let's do a final wrap up. I would like to know, just real quick, maybe 10-second response from each of you. Gary, we'll start with you, then we'll go to James. What's the one thing you want people to walk away with today?
Well, first of all, thanks a lot for the opportunity. I'm really sorry we've run out of time for the interpretive dance that we promised for everybody at the end of this webinar. So yeah, no, the one thing to walk away with, is be human, be empathetic, be sincere. The people, by and large, will appreciate you leveling with them, even in a bad news situation. So have the confidence, have the courage to communicate in a straightforward, empathetic way, and that will pay off both in the short and long term.
James, one takeaway for the audience?
Yeah, I can call it the communications golden rule, right? Communicate to others the way you would want to be communicated to. Your main goal is build trust. So if you with trust, you've got everything. Without it, next to nothing. So thank you, and thanks
Awesome.
for having me on.
Of course. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, James, for joining. Thank you, everyone, for attending today. I had such a fantastic time on this. I think we probably could have gone for another hour, but maybe we'll save that for a part 2 down the road. Quick reminder to everybody, today's webinar, Communicating Bad News, is brought to you by Groupe.io. You can check it out at group with an E at the end of Groupe.io, or the Group app in the App Store. If you got any questions, you can reach out to Kemp Mulaney, and actually that should say contact at Groupe.io. I thought I had changed that, but I guess not. Thank you, Gary and James, once again. Thank you again, everybody, for attending. And with that, we will bid everybody adieu.